Hello everyone and welcome back for some more Drag Race gossip, secrets and drama. So today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to go through every single season of RuPaul's Drag Race US and I'll identify the queen who got the so-called villain edit, because we all know this is usually one of the most talked about topics each season. I'm going to base my choices on what the fandom and the wider media think, but also blended with my personal opinions as a super fan of the show who has admittedly watched the show an embarrassing amount of times. And to make this a bit more interesting, I also ran a poll on my YouTube post tab, and I got all of you to vote on who you think is the villain for each season. So at the end of each section, I'll reveal what you all voted for, and we'll see whether your votes line up with what I think. I'll also show some of your comments from the poll as well. Just as a quick note before we start, a villain edit isn't always the same as actually being a villain. Sometimes the queens earned it, sometimes the producers leaned into a storyline that wasn't really there, so me picking someone as the villain isn't me being mean about them. I'm just talking about who was presented as a villain on a highly edited TV show. And as always, please do not send hate to any of the queens. Okay, and with that, let's get started. Also, if you want to take part and have your votes counted in my future videos, make sure you subscribe to my channel and you'll be notified when I post more polls on YouTube. Thank you! Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Season 1 had only 9 queens, so there was less room to hide in the edit, but I think the original villain edit has to go to Rebecca Glasscock. Season 1 is the season everyone kind of forgets about, partly because of that weird blurry filter that the entire season was shot in, but the villain dynamic was kind of clear from the start. Rebecca made it all the way to the final 3, despite being seen by the rest of the cast as someone who didn't really earn her spot. The others felt like she was coasting on her looks, and was dismissive of other queens and was overconfident. The defining moment came when Jade called her, quote, the fakest B word I have ever known in my life. That kind of line in episode 3 or 4 sets the entire tone of how a queen is going to be perceived for the rest of the season. Whether her edit was fair or not is up for debate, but I do think it's a pretty obvious choice. Rebecca was the original villain, and even though season 1, as I said, often gets overlooked, it set the template in my eyes for what a Drag Race villain edit looks like. So every villain that came after that, in a way, owes it to Rebecca Glasscock. And looking at the results of your votes, you seem to agree, with 41.4% of you voting for Rebecca. However, interestingly, Chanel got 31.2%, which is also quite a lot. I guess this is because of Chanel's iconic, quote, I nominate myself monologue. I can see why people would say Chanel's confidence was sometimes portrayed as a villain edit, but in my eyes, Rebecca takes it for season 1. Moving on to season 2, and I think this is a tough one in my eyes because the villain edit I think could go either way between Tyra Sanchez or Raven. I probably would say Raven was often portrayed as worse on the show itself and had several moments where the editors showed this, but Tyra also had her fair share of moments too. For example, the wedding dress design challenge was the standout moment when pretty much all the queens turned on Tyra and voted for her to go home, saying that she had a bratty attitude. Tyra has definitely become a lot more controversial after the show, and the fandom has pretty much unanimously turned against her. But we're talking about on the season itself, and I think at the reunion, for example, Tyra was given a kind of redemption more than Raven was. So I think we have to give the actual villain edit for season 2 to Raven, but I think Tyra has arguably become the real life villain after the show. In terms of the votes, I think you also agree, because Raven got 40.9% and Tyra was not far behind with 37.5%, so I think it really depends on how you frame it. Now going on to season 3, I think season 3 is genuinely tricky because I don't think there's a single villain. The big storyline that season was the Heathers versus the Boogers, which was more of a clique war rather than a one queen versus everyone situation. The Heathers consisted of Raja, Manila, Carmen, Delta and Yara, and the Boogers were everyone else. So if you're looking for the villain edit on season 3, I think it's more of a group edit, not an individual one. Carmen and Raja were often portrayed as the most openly shady, so I did immediately think of those two. But Raja did apologise at the reunion and maybe had sort of a redemption, which means that Carmen might take it. But I think Mimi Unfirst maybe takes it the most because of a few different things, such as the moment she picked up India Farah during the lip sync, the sugar daddy fight in Untucked with Shangela, and also her awkward comments at the reunion. In some ways though, I don't think Mimi was actually on the season long enough to be the actual villain, but it was quite hard to pick just one villain for this season, so I was really curious to see who you all voted for. I was slightly surprised, however, that the vote was actually pretty clear, with Mimi getting 44.2%, which was by far the biggest portion. Then it was Raja with 16.8%, and then Carmen with 10.3%. But I do wonder whether Mimi's majority in this was in some way influenced by her controversial behaviour after the show and on All Stars 1, even though in my eyes that is separate and shouldn't count towards season 3. Now moving on to season 4's villain edit, which in my opinion is probably the most iconic one in the entire franchise, which is of course Fifi O'Hara, who now goes by Jeremy. The "go back to Party City where you belong" line will go down in history forever. Jeremy versus Sharon Needles was the perfect storm. Jeremy was the pageant queen who saw herself as the deserving frontrunner, whereas Sharon was the spooky alternative queen who was coasting on personality rather than polish. And their feud essentially ran for the entire season. Jeremy has since spoken about how the edit affected her, and she did go on to do All Stars 2 to try and rehabilitate her image, but that didn't really work out either. But a lot of the fans now say that Jeremy was largely used by production to be the villain. Some people, including Bob the Drag Queen, have argued that Sharon Needles was the true villain of season 4 because of her controversial behaviour since the show. But in terms of the actual edit on the show itself, I think there's no doubt that the villain edit has to go to Jeremy. And I think this was a pretty clear case because 92.5% of you voted for Jeremy/Fifi, which is one of the most landslide votes in this entire video. Okay, season 5. To me, season 5's villain edit goes to Roxy Andrews, and the receipts are mainly to do with her behaviour towards Jinx Monsoon. There were many defining moments: Roxy mocking Jinx for her drag and her quirkiness, the comments about comedy queens being less deserving, and the broader Relaskatox versus Jinx moment. The Jinx parts in particular have aged pretty badly, because Jinx went on to win the crown and then came back to win again in All Stars 7. And although Roxy did later acknowledge her poor behaviour and came back for her redemption on both All-Star seasons, I think it's pretty clear that season 5's villain edit has to go to Roxy. Again, I think your votes were pretty clear on this, with Roxy getting 89.7% of the vote, and the second and third highest votes were Coco Montrese and Serena Chacha respectively, but they didn't even come close. Okay, season 6 is where I think this topic gets really interesting. This is one of the more contested seasons in my opinion, because I think you've got 3 potential candidates depending on who you ask. Gia Gunn got the early season shady villain edit because she was very openly critical about the other queens. But then you've also got Laganja Estranja, who got what I would call the meltdown edit. She wasn't framed as a villain in the traditional sense, but she had so many emotional moments and conflicts that she became seen as difficult. But then one of the more interesting options is Courtney Act. Even though she made it to the top 3 and was seen as a polished season queen, she was also very critical of Jocelyn Fox and made some pretty cutting remarks about other queens, which left a bad taste in some viewers' mouths. So that begs the question, who is the actual villain of season 6? My choice probably would have to go to Gia Gunn, because the actual edit on screen was probably the most villainous for Gia, and the producers clearly leaned into her being the antagonist, something that she continued when she came back for All Stars. In terms of your votes, this was one of the most split ones, which doesn't really surprise me. Gia Gunn did come out on top just about with 36.9%. But interestingly, Darian Lake came out next with 33%. And I can totally see this when I think back on it, particularly because of the feud between Darian and Ben de la Creme, but Darian is not who originally came to my mind, so I found this vote really fascinating. So going on to season 7, I think this is where this video's premise starts to wobble a little bit, because season 7 is often seen as a bit lackluster, even though I don't personally agree with that, but it was a more looks-driven season rather than personality-driven. And there just wasn't as much conflict if you compare it to previous seasons. Pearl was definitely given a villain edit of being supposedly unbothered and also ungrateful, such as the stare-off moment with RuPaul, but I'm not sure this edit was really deserved. Violet Chachki probably was the biggest villain in some ways, although I also think as the season progressed, she was shown to be more apologetic and sympathetic, most likely because they wanted to set her up to be the winner. But when I think back to season 7, I do remember Violet being portrayed as the most villainous, so I'd have to give it to Violet. In your votes, you also voted for Violet first with 39%. However, Kennedy Davenport came out second with 16.8%, which, looking back on it, I can totally see because of the older queens versus the younger queens storyline, and Kennedy being dismissive of the younger queens. And Pearl was not that far behind in third place with 16.6%. Now, season 8, to me, the villain edit is pretty obvious, and I think it has to go to Acid Betty. She had multiple clashes with other queens on the season, and said herself that she is a B-word. One of her most remembered moments was her dismissive attitude about Trixie Mattel when they played a video clip of Trixie for Kimchi in Untucked. And Trixie even confronted Acid about this at the finale. Throughout the season, Acid was framed as harsh, dismissive of the queens that she saw as less polished, and she leaned into the villain role pretty openly while on the show. There is also a strong argument for Derek Barry to be the villain, because she had her own friction with Bob the Drag Queen, and was portrayed as the cocky Britney Spears impersonator who didn't quite fit in with the rest of the cast. But I think Derek's was more of a delusional edit rather than a villain edit, so to me, Acid is the clear choice. Your votes also seem to agree because Acid got over half of the votes with 54.1%, and although Derek still got a sizable 34.5%, Acid was still number 1 by quite some margin. So season 9 I think is perhaps one of the most interesting cases in this entire franchise because there are several candidates that could be the villain, and let me explain why. Valentina is probably the one that comes to mind a lot, but I'm not sure if she was actually a true villain. I think she was just more a cause of friction. She was the breakout star, was beloved by the fandom, and her iconic "I'd like to keep it on please" mask moment during the lip sync has gone down in history. But then the reunion happened. The reunion is where I think the cast collectively turned on Valentina. They accused her of being fake, acting like she was above the competition, and being more interested in her own self-image rather than actually protecting her castmates from online hate. Nina, Aja, Shay, and Farah, as well as others, all called Valentina out in different ways. Then, when Valentina won Miss Congeniality, the others decided to change it to fan favourite instead because they didn't think she was actually congenial. What makes this case so fascinating to me is that the so-called Villaintina edit happened pretty much in a single episode retroactively, and it kind of reshaped how the entire season is now remembered. The other candidate for the villain edit on season 9 is potentially Nina Bonina Brown, but to me, Nina was more struggling due to self-confidence and self-sabotage rather than anything else, so I'm not sure she had a true villain edit. So I think I'll have to give it to Valentina, although I'm not sure she's really a villain in the traditional sense. In terms of your votes, you actually voted for Aja number 1 with 36.2% of the vote, then Nina with 24.6%, and then Alexis Michelle with 16.6%. And to be fair, I can see why you may vote for Aja. When I was thinking through the season for this video, I did remember Aja's iconic so-called aggressive complimenting to Valentina, saying, "You're perfect, you're beautiful, you look like Linda Evangelista," but that was kind of it. But now that I think about it, Aja did also have some diva-ish moments during the season, and she was the one that brought up at the reunion the issues with Valentina not being congenial, so maybe Aja did get the true villain edit of season 9. Okay, season 10 is a bit of a tricky one that needs to be handled carefully, because I think it speaks to something bigger about how the villain edit works on the show. I think it's clear that the edit portrayed the Vixen as the villain. Her conflicts with Eureka and Aquaria in particular, but also with RuPaul herself at the reunion, presented her as combative. But as they mentioned on the show, there is a well-documented pattern of people of colour disproportionately getting the villain edit on Drag Race, and in general, often getting called the quote, angry black woman. This was even pointed out during the Vixen's fight with Aquaria in Untucked, when Aquaria started crying. There are even news articles talking about this exact topic of how race can be a factor in how the fandom perceives a queen, and how white queens are often given a pass, whereas queens of colour are not. I will just say though, I don't agree with everything the Vixen did, and I think she does have to accept some accountability for her behaviour. However, I think we also have to acknowledge that she was often antagonised by people like Eureka, and maybe she overreacted, but Eureka even admitted that she, quote, poked the bear on purpose. So you could argue that Eureka is the true villain. But because the Vixen was consistently the one getting into arguments with other queens, and she even got called out by other queens of colour on the season, I think she is the clear choice of who got the villain edit. And again, this was a pretty unanimous result in your votes, with 87.9% of you voting for the Vixen, with Eureka coming in second with only 5%. Right, now going on to Season 11, I think Season 11's villain edit has to go to Silky Nutmeg Ganache, with Raja O'Hara as a close runner-up. The defining storyline of Season 11 was Silky versus Evie Oddly. Silky was portrayed as loud, confrontational, and had a habit of dominating the conversation. She also stayed in the competition long past when many people thought she should have gone home, which created a lot of fan frustration. But I found an interesting article by The Tab, which actually argued that this was more of a producer issue rather than a Silky issue, because they think production kept Silky around because she was creating drama, but the audience took it out on Silky. Raja also got significant villain edit moments in my opinion for her conflicts with the other queens, as well as some of her cutting moments in her confessionals, like when she said that Evie smelled bad. Again, I don't excuse Silky and Raja entirely, because I do think they have to take responsibility for what they said and did, but both of them have since spoken after the season about the harassment they received after it aired, which links back to what I was saying earlier about the queens of colour being treated harsher by the fandom. But I do ultimately think Silky is the one who got the main villain edit on Season 11. Moving on to your votes, you actually put Raja as number 1 with 51.5%, with Silky coming in second with 33.6%. I was slightly surprised because Silky was on the show longer than Raja, so in my eyes she developed more of a villain edit. Whereas I feel like Raja's edit was more concentrated at the reunion because she was eliminated midway through the season, but I guess you could argue it either way. Now going on to Season 12, I think the Season 12 villain edit is pretty clear cut, and I think it goes to Britta, mainly because of her mistreatment of Aiden Zane. Britta was openly dismissive of Aiden throughout the season, and implied that she did not deserve to be there. This became one of the biggest storylines of the season because, to be honest, there wasn't a lot of other tension on the season, so I think the editors really had to go in hard on that storyline. To her credit though, Britta has spoken since about how she regretted the way she came across and did try to reconcile with Aiden, but I think the edit was quite clear. I should also mention that season 12 is obviously overshadowed by the Sherry Pie controversy, which I've spoken about on my channel numerous times, but all of that happened after the season and not directly on the show, so although Sherry did have her moments of being shady and definitely is the villain after the show, I don't think she got the villain edit on the show itself. And it looks like you agree as well, because 58.8% of you voted for Britta for number 1, with Sherry coming in second with 16.6%, but I think that's mainly influenced by Sherry's disqualification. Okay, so season 13 is another one where I think the villain edit could go either way. Candy Muse made it to the final 2 and is probably the most commonly cited villain, but a lot of that framing came from the fandom itself rather than the edit. Candy was loud, confrontational, and had clashes with multiple queens, particularly with Tamisha Iman. And the audience response to Candy was pretty divided, especially when she was saved from elimination, which many people saw as a way to keep her around for more drama. Tamisha, though, also had her own friction on the season, particularly her early season comments that came across as harsh to the younger queens. So I think this is another one where the season did not have one clear villain, and the audience kind of filled the gap with Candy. Saying all of that though, Candy is my choice because I think she's the closest fit, but I wouldn't disagree if you voted for someone else. Your votes were also pretty much a landslide for this one too though, with 70.7% of you voting for Candy, and Tamisha came in second with 15.3%, then it was Elliot with 2 T's coming third with 8.6%. For season 14, there's not really any question in my mind that the villain edit goes to Dire Betty. Her main conflicts were with Jasmine Kennedy, and the friction between them ran for several episodes and came to a head at the reunion. And even other queens like Alyssa Hunter said, quote, "Dire, you are the B word." Dire was framed as bitter and competitive, although she did have a redemption arc later in the season. And in general, I feel like season 14 was a bit of a kumbaya season, so even though Dire is the clear villain, I think she was actually a pretty soft villain compared to other seasons. Going on to your votes, again, no surprises, Dire came out on top with a whopping 77.8% of the vote, with Jasmine Kennedy coming in second with only 11.6%. Okay, moving on to season 15, and I think the season 15 villain is pretty clear and it goes to Mistress Isabel Brooks. Mistress positioned herself as the primary antagonist. She had clashes with multiple queens, she leaned into being shady, and had long-running tensions with queens like Lucy LaDuca, who always seemed to take the bait. Luxe Noir London was also pretty vocal with her thoughts, but Mistress definitely had the more dominant villain edit, and she's also embraced her villain status after the show and on All Stars, so this was a pretty obvious choice. Going into your votes, it's no surprise that Mistress came out on top with 78.5% of the vote, although to be honest, I thought it was going to be more, frankly. But what surprised me more was that Lucy actually came out higher than Luxe, with 10.3% compared to Luxe's 8%. To me, Lucy's edit was more delusional rather than a villain edit, but I can see the rationale behind it. Okay, moving on to season 16, and I think this is another very obvious one, and it clearly goes to Plain Jane, and this might be one of the more clearly defined villain edits since season 4. Plain spent the entire season being openly shady, dismissive, and antagonistic to the other queens, particularly a mandatory meeting. And the thing is, Plain leaned into it and made being the villain part of her brand. I mean, she recently appeared on the show House of Villains, which speaks for itself. In terms of your votes, this is actually the strongest vote of all of the seasons, with a staggering 93.3% of you voting for Plain Jane. And the only other queens who appear on this chart are Q and Dawn, who got a measly 2.8 and 1.1% respectively. Right, moving on to the penultimate season, which is season 17, and I think that villain edit definitely goes to Arrietty, although I will say Lexi Love also had her moments. The smoking gun here, I think, is the ironically titled Villain's Roast episode, where Arrietty was caught sabotaging Jules Sparkles by stealing her jokes. That moment alone would have probably earned her the villain edit, but what really solidified it was Arrietty's mirror message, where she said that Anya Nerve has bad breath and needs to brush her teeth. Anya then got upset, saying it was actually due to a health problem, which she had mentioned to the other queens. So this quickly turned the fans against Arrietty, and so the villain edit was pretty clear. Again, in terms of your vote, Arrietty came out way on top with 72.4%, which is not surprising. But what I did find interesting is that the rest of the votes were actually pretty evenly split, so maybe there were more villains on season 17 than we thought. And finally, moving on to season 18, which is the most recent season at the time of recording this video. This one is a bit tricky because I don't think there was really a villain on this season, because again, it was pretty kumbaya. At one point, they tried to push Nene Coco as the villain with the storyline that she was unaware of how shady she was, and they also tried to present Discord Adams as being petulant or even a cheater during the design challenge, but to me, both of these storylines felt a bit like a stretch. I think the actual villain edit of season 18 was probably Briar Blush. She was named by the cast as the villain in the pre-season interviews, and they made sure to tell us right away during her entrance when they showed confessionals of the other queens talking about the way she came in acting like she owned the place. On top of that, there was also Briar's energy in the workroom, as well as her clashes with several of the queens, including Mia Starr and Athena Dion. But I think because Briar had the medical emergency when she fainted on stage and was eliminated pretty early in the season, her storyline to be a villain was cut quite short, which is when, in my opinion, they switched focus to queens that I mentioned earlier like Nene and Discord. So my choice for the villain edit is definitely Briar Blush, although again, I don't think she was actually a particularly strong villain, and I also don't think she was around long enough to have a full villain edit. Going on to your votes, you all seem to agree as well, although perhaps not as many as I thought you might, with 66% of you voting for Briar. But Athena came in second with 9%, above Discord with 7.3%, which did kind of surprise me, but I wonder if that's more because people felt like Athena coasted due to her family alliances, but I do think you could make the case for any of them being the villain. Also, as I mentioned earlier, please do not send hate to any of the queens involved in this video, and remember that this is all just for fun and entertainment about a TV show, and it's really not that serious. So there you go, there was a video giving my thoughts and your votes on who you think got the villain edit on all 18 seasons of RuPaul's Drag Race. Were there any surprises in this video? And which of the queens do you think got the most undeserved villain edit? If you'd like to watch my videos before they go on YouTube, as well as see the things that I cut out of my Roscoe's recaps, as well as other exclusive content, please check out my Patreon. It just costs a few dollars a month and it really does help support the channel, and I'll put a link to my Patreon in the description. I'd also like to say thank you so much to all of my amazing Patreon members. I really do pinch myself all the time thinking about how lucky I am to have all of you supporting me, and it really does make a huge difference to the channel, so thank you all so much. Please make sure you like and comment on this video to help boost it in the algorithm and promote it to more people. And please make sure you subscribe. It's free, it only takes 2 seconds, and it really does make a big difference to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll join me in the future for some more Drag Race gossip, secrets, and drama. Thank you so much. Bye.